The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, was the longest war of the 20th century and one of the bloodiest and most costly in economic and human terms. The war began on September 22, 1980, when Iraqi forces invaded western Iran along the common border between the two countries. While the previous Iraqi government claimed that the war began on the 4th of September, when Iran bombed a number of border points. The war ended with a ceasefire in 1988. Despite the withdrawal of forces and their return to their positions in which they were stationed before the war, the two sides did not sign a formal agreement in this regard until August 16, 1990. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein wanted to reassert his country's sovereignty over the two banks of the Shatt al-Arab, whose control was shared under the Algiers Agreement between the two countries in 1975. Saddam was also worried about Ayatollah Khomeini's attempts to export the Iranian Revolution abroad by inciting the Shiite majority in Iraq. Iraq took advantage of the chaos and weakness that Iran was still going through following the overthrow of the Shah's rule about a year ago, as well as the state of international isolation that the new Iranian Authority was experiencing, especially in the wake of the occupation of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the holding of dozens of hostages there. The new authority in Iran had dissolved the armed forces and security services that had existed during the rule of the Shah, which encouraged Saddam to launch war and surprise Iran. The Iraqi army advanced into Iranian territory along a wide front in the Iranian province of Khuzestan. Iraqi forces captured the city of Khorramshahr, but failed to capture the important oil refining center in Abadan. By December 1980, the Iraqi offensive faltered about 80 to 120 kilometers inside Iran after encountering unexpected Iranian resistance. Iran began launching counterattacks using the Revolutionary Guards and its regular armed forces, forcing the Iraqis to retreat in 1981. The Iranians first pushed the Iraqis across the Iranian Kuran River and then recaptured the city of Khorramshahr in 1982. Iraq withdrew its forces from all the Iranian lands, which it had seized, and began to seek to end the war. But Iran, led by Khomeini, continued to reject peace efforts and continued the war in an attempt to overthrow the Iraqi president. Iraq's defenses were strengthened as soon as its forces retreated and became in a position to defend its lands, and the battle lines were stabilized, and the battles continued along the borders. Iran has repeatedly launched unsuccessful infantry attacks using human waves made up in part of young, ill-trained, or well-armed recruits. The Iraqis were confronting it with artillery and air power, with which Iraq was superior to Iran, and sometimes by using chemical weapons. The war entered a new phase when the two countries resorted to launching air and missile attacks against each other's cities, in addition to military and oil installations. The two sides also exchanged attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf. Iran's attacks on Kuwaiti and other Gulf oil tankers prompted the United States and several Western European countries to deploy warships in the Gulf to ensure the flow of oil to the rest of the world. The two countries' oil export capacity was severely reduced by airstrikes and pipeline closures, and the subsequent decline in their income and foreign exchange earnings brought the two countries' economic development programs to a halt. The Iraqi war effort was funded openly by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other neighboring Arab states and tacitly supported by the United States and the former Soviet Union, while Iran's two main allies were Syria and Libya. Iraq continued its calls for an agreement to end the war and bring peace between the two countries in the mid-1980s. His standing was severely damaged after evidence emerged of his use of chemical weapons against Iranian forces as well as against Iraqi Kurdish civilians whom Baghdad accused of siding with Iran in the war. One such attack on and around the Kurdish village of Halabja in March 1988 killed as many as 5,000 civilians. In the mid-1980s, stalemate dominated the battle lines. In August 1988 the decline of Iran's economy and recent Iraqi gains on the battlefield forced Iran to accept the unbrokered ceasefire. The total number of war casualties on both sides is not known precisely. But both countries were in a state of mobilization. Most of the men were of draft age under arms and the number of casualties was enormous. Estimates of the total number of war casualties range from 1 million to 2 million people. But the number of casualties on the Iranian side is greater than on the Iraqi side because the Iraqis remained on the defensive during most stages of the war, while Iran launched attack after attack using massive human waves. In economic terms, the two countries emerged from the war with huge losses that exceeded $400 billion in terms of material damage, while the direct cost of the war amounted to about $230 billion. The Iran